The first thing I noticed at my son's company ceremony wasn't the stage, the applause, or the elegant ballroom filled with people in tailored suits. It was my name tag. It sat neatly on the white linen table in front of me, printed in careful black letters. Not Margaret Whitmore. Not Daniel's mother. Just two quiet words. Guest, sponsored table. I stared at it for a moment longer than anyone probably realized. Around me, the ballroom at the Grand Riverside Hotel shimmered with soft gold lighting and the quiet clink of glasses. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and wine, and a large screen behind the stage displayed the proud logo of Whitmore Dynamics, the company my son Daniel had built over the past decade. People were dressed for celebration. There were city officials, investors, executives from other firms, and employees who looked both proud and slightly nervous to be sitting in such an impressive room. Everyone seemed excited. Everyone except me. Across the table, my daughter-in-law Ashley noticed me looking at the name tag. She tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they already know what you're thinking. Then she smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It was polite, controlled, and just warm enough that anyone watching would think she was being kind. "We had to keep the seating professional tonight," she said lightly, adjusting the silver bracelet on her wrist. "It's mostly investors and partners up front." Her voice carried the gentle confidence of someone who believed she was completely in charge of the room. I nodded once. "Of course," I said. My voice sounded calm, even to me. I folded my hands on the table and looked around the ballroom again. 10 years earlier, Daniel had been working out of a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with a folding table as his desk. I remembered the smell of cheap coffee and the stacks of paperwork covering every surface. I remembered the long phone calls where he sounded hopeful one moment and exhausted the next. And I remembered the day he came to my kitchen table with a business plan printed on 20 slightly crooked pages. That memory stayed with me now as a promotional video began playing on the giant screen above the stage. The room dimmed. Soft music filled the air. The video showed sleek offices, successful projects, smiling employees, and Daniel, standing confidently in front of a modern glass building downtown. A narrator's voice spoke about vision, risk, and leadership. People at the surrounding tables leaned forward, watching with admiration. A few even applauded softly when Daniel appeared on screen shaking hands with a city council member. I watched quietly. Ashley clapped politely beside me, her eyes bright with pride. And somewhere in the middle of that glowing story about ambition and success, I noticed something else. My son was telling the entire history of his company, but the beginning of that story was missing. I sat quietly as the lights brightened again and the applause filled the ballroom, warm and confident, the kind of applause people give when they believe they have just witnessed a remarkable success story. Daniel stepped onto the stage a moment later, tall and composed in a navy suit that fit him perfectly, the same calm smile he had practiced since he was a teenager appearing on his face as he shook hands with the host of the ceremony. People around the room straightened in their chairs, some lifting their phones to take pictures. I watched him the same way I had watched him for the past 40 years, noticing the small things other people would never see. The slight pause before he spoke, the way his shoulders settled once he reached the podium, the careful breath he always took before beginning something important. 10 years ago, he began, his voice clear through the microphone. This company started with nothing but an idea and a lot of late nights. The audience chuckled softly, recognizing the familiar story of hard work and determination. Daniel spoke well. He always had. He described the early days of Whitmore Dynamics as if they were a heroic adventure. Long hours, empty offices, a young entrepreneur willing to take risks when no one else believed in him. Every sentence sounded polished, like a story he had told many times before. Around me, people nodded with admiration. I heard someone behind me whisper that Daniel Whitmore was one of the most impressive self-made leaders in the state. Another voice said the company was already worth more than $200 million. I folded my hands together on the table and listened. Ashley leaned slightly closer to me, the faint scent of expensive perfume drifting in the air between us. She looked toward the stage with the kind of pride people show when they believe they helped build something important. "He practiced that speech for weeks," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving Daniel. "Daniel really believes in telling the story the right way." I nodded again. The right way? The words settled in my mind like a small stone dropped into still water. On the large screen behind Daniel, photographs appeared one after another. The first tiny office. The first 5 employees. The first warehouse lease signed 3 years later. There were pictures of investors, business partners, and the ribbon-cutting ceremony when their headquarters opened downtown. The crowd responded warmly each time a new milestone appeared. More applause. More smiles. It was a beautiful story. Clean. Inspiring. Carefully arranged. But while everyone else watched the screen, I noticed something missing. The very first beginning. The moment before the office. Before the investors. Before the company even had a name. That part of the story never appeared on the screen. And Daniel never mentioned it. I kept my eyes on the screen while the applause slowly faded and Daniel continued speaking with the calm confidence that had helped him win investors, partners, and a room full of admiration tonight. He talked about persistence, about believing in an idea when the odds were not in your favor, about the courage it takes to risk everything for something you believe will matter one day. The audience listened carefully, some nodding, some smiling as though they recognized themselves in his words. A server passed behind my chair and placed a glass of sparkling water on the table, the bubbles rising quietly to the surface while the room remained focused on the stage. I lifted the glass but did not drink. My attention was somewhere else now. My mind had already stepped back 10 years earlier, to a much smaller room that did not have chandeliers or polished marble floors. Back then, Daniel had arrived at my house on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a worn leather folder under his arm. I still remember the weather that day. It had been late autumn and the wind had pushed dry leaves across my driveway while he stood at the door, looking both excited and nervous at the same time. We sat at the same kitchen table where he had done his homework when he was a boy. The table still had a small scratch on the corner from the science project he built in 8th grade. Daniel spread the papers out in front of me carefully, smoothing each page as if they were more fragile than ordinary paper. He explained everything in great detail. The technology idea, the potential clients, the risk. He spoke quickly at first, then slower when he realized I was listening to every word. At one point he leaned back in the chair and rubbed his hands together, the same way he did when he was trying to solve a difficult math problem years earlier. Finally, he looked at me with a seriousness I had rarely seen in his face before. He said the banks had refused him. He said the investors wanted proof the company already worked before they would consider supporting it. Then he said he only needed one person to believe in him first. I remember folding my hands together on the table the same way I did tonight in the ballroom. I remember studying the numbers he had written in careful columns across the pages. And I remember the moment I stood up from the chair, walked to the hallway closet, and opened the small metal lockbox where I kept documents that mattered. When I returned to the table, I placed a single envelope beside his business plan. Daniel looked at it quietly for a moment before opening it. Inside was a check. $120,000. The savings I had built over 25 years working 2 jobs. Daniel had stared at the number for a long time before finally looking up at me with eyes that were suddenly bright with disbelief and gratitude. That was the real beginning of Whitmore Dynamics. The beginning no one in this ballroom had seen. Daniel had not spoken for nearly a full minute after opening that envelope. I remember the quiet in my kitchen that afternoon, the ticking of the small clock above the stove, the faint sound of a car passing outside on Maple Street. He kept looking down at the check as if the number might suddenly change if he blinked too many times. $120,000 was not a small amount of money for anyone, but for me it represented something much larger than a number. It represented every early morning I had driven to the hospital for the first job, and every late evening I had spent cleaning offices downtown for the second one. It represented 25 years of careful saving, of saying no to vacations, of driving the same car long after most people would have replaced it. Daniel finally looked up from the check and shook his head slowly. He said he could not accept that kind of money from me. He said it was too much risk. He said if the company failed, he would never forgive himself for losing what I had worked so hard to save. I remember smiling then, not because the decision was easy, but because it was already made. I told him something simple that day. I told him that believing in your child is not a risk. It is a responsibility. Daniel sat very still after that. His eyes moved from the check to the business plan and then back to me again. Finally, he folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope as though he understood that what sat on the table between us was more than financial support. It was trust. A week later we met with a small attorney in a modest office above a bakery downtown. The building smelled like fresh bread when we walked through the hallway. The attorney explained the paperwork slowly and clearly, making sure Daniel understood that the money was not simply a gift. It was an investment. My name would appear on the founding documents as the first financial backer of the company. Daniel signed his part with steady hands. I signed mine just beneath his. The ink dried quickly on the paper while sunlight came through the window beside the desk. After that day, Daniel worked harder than I had ever seen him work before. He moved into that small apartment office, bought used furniture from a second-hand store, and began building the company step by step. I visited once or twice during the first year. The place was cramped and cluttered, but Daniel always looked determined when he talked about the future. And every time he thanked me for believing in him before anyone else did. Sitting in the ballroom now, listening to the applause that followed his speech, I wondered quietly when that part of the story had disappeared. I watched Daniel step away from the podium. While the audience applauded again, louder this time, the sound filling the ballroom with the confident rhythm of success being celebrated. People at the surrounding tables leaned toward one another, exchanging impressed looks and quiet comments about vision, leadership, and determination. A few investors stood briefly to shake Daniel's hand as he walked down the steps from the stage. Cameras flashed. Laughter drifted across the room. From where I sat, everything looked polished and complete, like a story that had already been decided long before anyone in this room arrived tonight. Ashley was the first to stand when Daniel returned to our table. She placed one hand lightly on his arm and smiled with the easy grace of someone who understood how to perform in a room full of important people. "That was perfect," she said, her voice warm and confident. Daniel nodded, still holding the small glass trophy the host had just handed him. He looked relieved, like a man who had successfully crossed a bridge he had been preparing to walk across for weeks. Several executives approached our table one after another, offering congratulations and firm handshakes. One man in a gray suit leaned toward Daniel and said the company's story was one of the most inspiring entrepreneurial journeys he had heard in years. Another investor mentioned the impressive growth from a small startup to a corporation valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Daniel thanked them politely, accepting each compliment with the careful humility that successful leaders learn to display in public. I sat quietly beside them, listening to the conversations move back and forth across the table. A woman from another firm glanced at me briefly and asked Ashley if I was part of the extended guest group. Ashley smiled politely before answering, her tone light and casual. She explained that the evening was mostly for partners, investors, and leadership staff. Her words were smooth and effortless, like someone who had practiced this kind of explanation before. The woman nodded politely and returned her attention to Daniel. No one asked another question. I looked down at the table for a moment. The white linen cloth was perfectly pressed, and the silverware had been arranged with careful precision. The small name card was still there beside my plate. Guest, sponsored table. I turned it slightly with my fingers, studying the simple letters printed across the front. 10 years ago, my name had appeared on the first legal documents that allowed Whitmore Dynamics to exist at all. Tonight it appeared on a piece of paper that quietly suggested I had been invited out of courtesy. Across the table, Ashley laughed softly at something one of the investors said, her voice confident and relaxed. Daniel listened beside her, nodding in agreement as they discussed future expansion plans and new technology projects the company hoped to launch next year. The conversation moved forward without me, smooth and comfortable, as though the beginning of the story had never existed. The evening continued with the smooth rhythm of a celebration that had been carefully planned down to the smallest detail. Soft music began playing again near the stage while servers moved quietly between the tables with trays of dinner plates. The smell of roasted vegetables and warm bread drifted through the ballroom, mixing with the low hum of conversation that filled the space. People seemed relaxed now that the formal speeches were finished. Laughter appeared more often. Business cards changed hands. A group of executives near the front of the room began discussing a new partnership opportunity while another table debated future technology trends. It was the kind of evening where successful people congratulated one another and spoke confidently about the future. I remained seated, watching the room the way someone watches a play after realizing they are not actually part of the cast. Ashley continued speaking with several investors across the table. Her posture was elegant and assured, her voice bright and enthusiastic whenever someone mentioned the company's growth. She described upcoming expansion plans and talked about how Daniel's leadership had created a strong culture inside the company. She was good at this. Very good. People listened to her the same way they listened to Daniel earlier on the stage. At one point, an older gentleman with silver hair turned toward her and said he had always believed that behind every successful leader, there was someone helping manage the vision. Ashley smiled at the compliment. Daniel has done something extraordinary, she replied. He started with nothing but determination. The man nodded approvingly. Several people at the table murmured agreement. I noticed Daniel glance briefly in my direction before returning his attention to the conversation. It was only a quick look, the kind someone might give without fully realizing they had done it. Our eyes met for a moment. Then the conversation continued as if the moment had never happened. I lowered my gaze back to the table and reached for my small purse beside the chair. The leather felt familiar in my hands, worn slightly at the edges from years of use. Inside were only a few ordinary things. My phone, my reading glasses, a folded handkerchief, and one envelope. I had not planned to bring it tonight. In fact, I had almost left it in the drawer where it had rested for many years. But something about the invitation to this ceremony had made me pause before leaving the house earlier that evening. I remembered opening the drawer, looking down at the envelope for a long moment, and then placing it quietly into my purse without really explaining the decision to myself. I slid the envelope out now and rested it lightly on my lap beneath the table. The paper inside was older but still perfectly preserved. Legal documents have a way of lasting longer than memories. Across the table, Ashley laughed again, her voice bright and confident as she described how Whitmore Dynamics had grown from a small idea into a company that now employed more than 400 people across 3 states. The investors listened with interest. Daniel nodded beside her. And in my hands, the envelope remained very still. The envelope rested quietly in my hands while the conversation around the table continued to move forward without pause. Investors asked questions about expansion into new markets. Someone mentioned a potential office in Chicago. Another executive spoke enthusiastically about how rare it was to see a company grow this quickly without losing its original vision. Daniel listened carefully to each comment, answering with the same thoughtful confidence he had shown on stage earlier. Ashley leaned forward slightly in her chair, her expression bright and engaged as she described the leadership culture inside the company. She explained how Whitmore Dynamics valued innovation, loyalty, and long-term thinking. Her words flowed smoothly, the kind of polished language people use when they are certain the room belongs to them. I sat quietly beside them, the envelope still resting on my lap beneath the table. The paper inside felt heavier than its thin edges suggested. It was strange how a single document could hold so many years inside it. Across the ballroom, the host of the evening stepped back onto the stage and gently tapped the microphone. The sound carried softly across the room, gradually pulling conversations to a close. People turned their chairs toward the stage again, some finishing the last sip of their drinks before giving their attention to the front of the room. The host smiled warmly at the audience and thanked everyone for attending the celebration. Then he explained that the evening would continue with a short acknowledgement of the company's earliest supporters, the individuals who had believed in the vision during its first uncertain days. A quiet ripple of interest moved through the crowd. Early investors often liked these moments. Recognition mattered in rooms like this. The host lifted a small card from the podium and began reading several names. A venture group from Boston, a technology advisor who had joined during the second year, a private equity partner who had helped guide the company's expansion 5 years earlier. Each name received polite applause as the individuals stood briefly to acknowledge the recognition. Ashley clapped confidently beside Daniel, her smile returning each time the room responded with appreciation. Then the host glanced down at the card once more before speaking again. He explained that the very first financial support for the company had come from someone whose belief had arrived long before the investors, before the partnerships, before the headquarters building downtown. A few curious murmurs moved through the audience. The host looked up from the card and spoke the name clearly into the microphone. Margaret Whitmore. For a moment the room remained completely still. I lifted the envelope slowly from my lap, and placed it on the table beside the small name card that still read guest, sponsored table. Then I stood. For a moment no one moved. The sound in the ballroom seemed to pause between breaths, as if the room itself needed a second to understand what had just been said. My name hung in the air above hundreds of white tablecloths and polished glasses. I noticed Daniel turn toward me slowly, the expression on his face shifting from polite curiosity to something quieter, something more complicated. Ashley blinked once, then again, as if she had not heard correctly. Around us, people began looking from the stage to our table, searching for the person the host had just named. I placed one hand lightly on the back of my chair and stepped away from the table. The envelope rested in my other hand. The carpet beneath my shoes was thick and soft, the kind used in hotels where important events are held. Each step toward the stage felt calm and steady. I had walked many rooms in my life, but none quite like this one. When I reached the front of the ballroom, the host greeted me with a polite smile and stepped slightly aside so I could stand near the microphone. The room was very quiet now. I looked out across the tables filled with executives, investors, and employees who had spent the evening celebrating a company they admired. Some faces looked curious. Others looked surprised. A few seemed uncertain about what this moment meant. I placed the envelope on the podium and opened it carefully. The document inside was simple but clear. The original founding agreement of Whitmore Dynamics. My name printed beside Daniel's. The first investment recorded in careful legal language. I did not need to hold it high for the room to understand. The host glanced down at the paper and nodded slowly. A faint murmur spread through the audience as people began piecing the story together. I looked toward Daniel then. He was still standing beside the table, the small trophy in his hand forgotten for the moment. Ashley sat beside him, her confident posture gone, her expression suddenly very still. I leaned slightly closer to the microphone, my voice calm when I finally spoke. I said that 10 years ago a young man came to my kitchen table with a dream and a business plan that many people believed was too risky to support. I said that sometimes the first person who believes in a dream does not appear in the final version of the story. The room remained silent as I paused for a moment. Then I added one more sentence, spoken gently but clearly. I said that success is a beautiful thing, but respect should never be forgotten along the way. After that I closed the envelope again and stepped back from the microphone. For a moment after I stepped away from the microphone, the ballroom remained completely silent. It was the kind of silence that arrives when a room full of people suddenly realizes they have just learned something important. I placed the envelope back into my purse and turned slowly toward the audience. From the stage the room looked even larger than it had from my seat earlier. Dozens of round tables stretched across the ballroom, each one filled with faces that had come expecting a celebration of success. Now many of those faces looked thoughtful instead of impressed. A few people began clapping quietly. The sound started near the front of the room, then spread slowly outward like ripples across water. Within seconds the applause grew stronger, not loud or dramatic, but steady and sincere. I nodded politely toward the host and stepped down from the stage. As I walked back across the carpet toward our table, the room gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed in softer tones. Some guests glanced toward me with small respectful smiles. Others leaned toward one another, quietly discussing the story they had just heard. When I reached the table, Daniel was still standing. The small trophy remained in his hand, but his expression had changed. He looked older in that moment, as though the bright lights of the evening had finally faded and left him facing something real. Ashley remained seated beside him, her posture rigid and her confident smile gone. For once she did not speak first. Daniel opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped. I did not wait for the words. Instead I reached for the small name card beside my plate. Guest, sponsored table. I studied it for a brief moment before placing it gently on top of the tablecloth. Then I looked at my son. My voice was calm when I finally spoke. I told him that building something successful is a wonderful achievement, but remembering the people who helped you begin is even more important. Daniel nodded slowly, the way someone does when they understand the truth of something but wish they had realized it sooner. Around us the evening continued. Investors returned to their conversations. Glasses clinked softly. The music near the stage began playing again. It was still a celebration after all. I picked up my purse and stepped away from the table. No one tried to stop me. As I walked toward the exit of the ballroom, I felt lighter than I had earlier that night. The story had finally been told the way it should have been from the beginning. And sometimes that is all respect really requires.